The darkness wasn't just visual, it felt like a physical weight, pressing in. I could taste the stale air, thick with the scent of damp concrete and something metallic, like old blood or rust. The hum of the emergency generator was a distant, dying cough, barely piercing the profound silence of the intake holding area during power outage. I kept running my thumb over the rough fabric of my trousers, a nervous habit I hadn't had since I was a kid. How did I get here? The question clawed at the back of my throat, a dry, bitter taste. It started, I suppose, with a letter, an unexpected inheritance, and a hunger for something more. Just 6 months ago, my life had been a meticulously planned grid of deadlines, blueprints, and the relentless hum of city traffic. I was Raj, an architect on the cusp, my portfolio brimming with sleek, minimalist designs that were, admittedly, a little too safe. I dreamt of grander projects, of buildings that spoke, that breathed. But the reality was a series of glass and steel boxes for corporate clients who preferred efficiency over imagination. My apartment, high in a downtown tower, offered a spectacular view of 1,000 other identical towers, a constant reminder of the urban sprawl I both contributed to and felt suffocated by. Then came the envelope. Thick, cream-colored stock, addressed to me in elegant, looping script. It wasn't a bill, not a junk mail offer. It was from a solicitor, informing me of the passing of a distant relative, a great-aunt I barely remembered, a name whispered at family gatherings I'd long since forgotten. And with her passing, a sprawling estate called Blackwood Reach was mine. My first reaction was disbelief, quickly followed by a rush of exhilarated ambition. A whole estate? Untouched? The solicitor's voice, dry and formal over the phone, had painted a picture of isolation, quite remote, Mr. Patel. Far from any major settlements. The nearest town, Havenwood, is a good hour's drive. Remote was an understatement. It sounded like a forgotten corner of the world. But for me, it wasn't a deterrent, it was an invitation. A blank canvas. My chance to finally build something truly my own, away from the constraints of city planning committees and corporate aesthetics. I liquidated my city life with a speed that surprised even me. The drive out to Blackwood Reach was a journey into another era. The paved roads gave way to gravel, then to little more than twin ruts carved through an increasingly dense forest. The trees grew taller here, their branches intertwining overhead, creating a perpetual twilight even in the middle of the day. My phone signal died miles back, leaving me with only the drone of my engine and the growing sense of anticipation. Havenwood itself was a blink-and-you'd-miss-it kind of place. A single general store, a petrol pump, and a handful of houses that looked like they'd been leaning against each other for a century. The proprietor of the general store, a grizzled man with eyes that seemed to hold generations of local knowledge, eyed my city car and my sleek, uncreased clothes with a peculiar mix of suspicion and pity. "Blackwood Reach, you say," he murmured, bagging my few provisions. His voice was a low rasp, like dry leaves skittering across pavement. "That's a ways out. Been empty a long time. Folks round here say it's best left that way." I laughed, a little too loudly. "Just needs a bit of renovation, I imagine. A grand old place, from what I hear." He didn't return my smile. "It's the land. It remembers. And it don't like new faces much." He paused, his gaze fixed on some point beyond my shoulder. "Especially those that try to change things." I shrugged off his words as the ramblings of a superstitious local, a charming quirk of the isolated community. My determination was a shield against such quaint fears. I was an architect, a pragmatist. I dealt with concrete and steel, not phantoms and folklore. I paid for my goods and left, the man's words echoing faintly, a strange, dissonant note in the symphony of my excitement. The last stretch of the journey was the most daunting. A narrow, overgrown lane that twisted and turned, finally opening into a clearing. And there it was. Blackwood Reach. It wasn't a manor in the traditional sense, not a grand, imposing edifice of stone and turrets. The entire complex was choked with ivy and wild brambles, a testament to decades of neglect. It wasn't beautiful, not in any conventional sense. It was ancient, wild, and utterly captivating. My architect's eye saw potential, a challenge. A tremor of unease. But I pushed it down. This was my fresh start. My masterpiece. I pulled my car to a halt before the rusted, sagging gate, its intricate ironwork barely visible beneath layers of grime. The house loomed, a silent, imposing presence, waiting. The drive to the estate was long, the paved road eventually giving way to a gravel track that snaked through a deepening forest. The trees grew thicker with every mile, their ancient branches forming a canopy that choked out the afternoon light. The air grew cooler, carrying the scent of pine needles, damp earth, and something else, a faint, almost metallic tang I couldn't place. My phone signal had vanished miles back, leaving me in a pocket of profound silence broken only by the crunch of tires. Finally, the forest parted, revealing the house. It wasn't just large, it was immense, a sprawling edifice of dark stone and weathered timber, rising like a forgotten monument against the bruised sky. Gabled roofs, countless windows, and a heavy, imposing front door, it spoke of an era of grandeur, now softened by neglect. Vines clawed at the walls, and the garden was a tangle of wild growth. A challenging project, certainly, but my architect's eye saw past the decay to the potential beneath. The kind of quiet that feels less like an absence of sound and more like a presence, watching. The air was still, heavy. I unlocked the heavy front door, its rusty hinges groaning in protest, and stepped inside. Dust motes danced in the slivers of light piercing the grimy windows. The air was thick with the smell of old wood, disuse, and something vaguely floral, cloying, like dried potpourri gone bad. My footsteps echoed on the grand staircase, the sound swallowed by the cavernous space. I spent the first few hours just walking, room after empty room, sketching layouts in my mind, noting structural issues, already envisioning the transformation. This was it, my blank canvas. My fresh start. As dusk settled, painting the estate in hues of gray and deep violet, the house began to talk. Or so I told myself. The creaks and groans of settling timber were constant, a symphony of age. The wind, which had picked up outside, whistled through gaps in the window frames, creating eerie, shifting tones. I dismissed them, one by one. An old house breathes. It settles. It makes noise. Faint, indistinct, like distant conversations carried on a crossbreeze. I'd pause, head cocked, listening intently. Nothing. Just the wind. I'd shake my head, attributing it to fatigue, the isolation playing tricks on my ears. I was determined to be rational. I set up my temporary workspace in what appeared to be an old study, clearing a space on a heavy oak desk. As I laid out my blueprints, a book from a nearby shelf, a leather-bound volume with no discernible title, slid an inch, then another, before thudding softly onto the desk. I stared at it, then at the shelf. No tremor, no vibration. The air was perfectly still. My hand hesitated before picking it up. I placed it back, carefully, making sure it was firmly seated. Minutes later, I looked up. The book was on the desk again. A prickle of unease started in my neck. Old house, settling shelves, I reasoned, though the shelf itself looked sturdy, the books tightly packed. I pushed the book back with more force, then went to make myself a strong coffee on the portable stove I'd brought. When I returned, the book remained in its place. Good. Just me being jumpy. The next day, the phenomena escalated. I was in the library, measuring the height of the towering shelves, when a distinct scraping sound came from the floor above. It wasn't the creak of old wood, it was a deliberate drag, like heavy furniture being pulled across bare boards. I called out, "Hello? Is anyone there?" My voice sounded thin, swallowed by the vastness. Silence was the only reply. I went upstairs, walking through empty bedrooms, each one thick with dust, nothing out of place. No sign of disturbance. It clung to me, raising goosebumps. I glanced towards the doorway. I was losing sleep. Every creak, every gust of wind, every flicker of my lamp played on my nerves. My architect's pragmatism was straining under the weight of the inexplicable. I started to wonder if the isolation wasn't just affecting my mood, but my perception, twisting mundane occurrences into something sinister. Then the storm hit. It was a sudden, violent tempest that roared in from the wilderness, lashing rain against the windows like handfuls of gravel. The wind howled, a guttural, sorrowful sound that seemed to emanate from the very walls of the house. I fumbled for my emergency flashlight, its beam cutting a trembling path through the inky blackness. I needed to check the main circuit breaker. I remembered seeing a diagram during my initial exploration, pointing to a section of the basement. The basement door, heavy and made of rough-hewn timber, groaned as I pushed it open. The beam of my flashlight revealed a long, narrow corridor, lined with shelves of forgotten jars and rusted tools. I moved slowly, the beam dancing ahead, illuminating cobweb-draped corners. It wasn't the wind. It was close, intimate, and utterly alien. My breath hitched. I spun around, sweeping the flashlight beam across the corridor. But my hand trembled so violently I almost dropped the flashlight. I forced myself into the small room. The electrical panel was a mess of antique wiring. As I examined it, trying to make sense of the corroded switches, the air around me suddenly plummeted in temperature. My breath plumed visible in the frigid air. It was real. The flashlight beam shook wildly. I whirled around, heart hammering against my ribs, expecting to see. What? The small, concrete room was empty. But as my light swept across the far wall, I saw it. It wasn't water. My architectural plans, my grand designs, my pragmatic resolve, they all shattered in that moment. This wasn't an old house settling. This wasn't my imagination. This was something else. And it knew my name. The guttural sound, a choked, rasping T that seemed to vibrate directly inside my ear canal, froze me. My flashlight beam, a frantic pendulum, swept across the dusty, cobweb-draped corners of the vast, empty room. Nothing. Just the skeletal shadows of forgotten furniture and the shimmering dust motes dancing in the beam. The air itself felt thick, heavy, like trying to breathe underwater. The echo of my own breath was the only reply. I stood there, rooted, for what felt like an eternity, straining to hear anything that could explain the sound. Was it the house settling? A draft whistling through a loose pane? My own overactive imagination, fueled by exhaustion and the sheer isolation of this place? I took a deep, shuddering breath, trying to force logic back into the forefront of my mind. It had to be. This old pile of bricks was probably full of strange noises. I convinced myself, or tried to, that the unsettling vocalization was nothing more than the groan of ancient timbers or the wind playing tricks. This house, I realized, was not just old, it felt alive in a way that defied explanation. I needed answers, something concrete to anchor myself against the rising tide of irrational fear. The house had an extensive, if neglected, study. The air was thick with the scent of old paper, dry rot, and something else, a faint, metallic tang I couldn't quite place. I started sifting through the chaos, pulling down heavy tomes, blowing dust from their covers. Most were obscure academic texts, or forgotten novels. But tucked away in a bottom drawer of a massive oak desk, Beneath a pile of yellowed blueprints for what looked like an early 20th century irrigation system, I found it, a collection of old journals and ledgers. Their pages were brittle, the ink often faded to a ghostly brown, but the handwriting was surprisingly legible in places. The first journal, bound in crumbling leather, belonged to a distant ancestor, a woman named Eleanor, from the late 1800s. Her early entries were mundane, chronicling daily life on the estate. But as I flipped through the decades, the tone shifted. It twists the mind until the truth is a lie and the lie, truth. My stomach tightened with each word. Another journal, this one a smaller, pocket-sized affair, detailed the accounts of a groundskeeper from the 1930s. My mind latched onto the old receiving chamber. I remembered seeing a faded notation on one of the estate's original blueprints, tucked away in the very back of the study. It was far from the main living quarters, designed, I presumed, for deliveries and storage, perhaps even for processing game from the vast wilderness surrounding the estate. This wasn't just folklore, these were personal accounts, spanning decades. Perhaps there were more records there, something that could explain the vague, terrifying hints. Armed with a more powerful lantern and a growing sense of unease, I navigated the labyrinthine passages of the house's service wing, following the rough map I'd sketched from the blueprint. I pushed open a heavy, iron-studded door, the hinges groaning in protest. Empty wooden crates were stacked haphazardly, their surfaces coated in a thick layer of dust. The air was utterly still, yet I felt a palpable pressure, as if the very atmosphere was being compressed around me. That's when I heard it again. It was too regular, too deliberate to be a settling house. It sounded like fingernails dragging across stone, or something trying to claw its way out. I held my breath, straining my ears, my focus narrowed to that single, insidious sound. It was coming from behind a stack of particularly large, rotted crates at the far end of the room. A chill that had nothing to do with the cold stone seeped into my bones. I was not alone. The guttural sound, a choked, rasping T that seemed to vibrate directly inside my ear canal, had frozen me solid. Nothing. Just the skeletal shadows of forgotten furniture and the shimmering dust motes dancing in the light. My breath hitched, a cold knot tightening in my stomach. Old house. Sounds. I forced myself to move, my boots crunching on unseen debris. As I pivoted, my light briefly caught a flicker at the edge of my vision, a quick, darting movement near a tall, draped wardrobe. My head snapped back, the beam steadying, but there was nothing. Only the heavy velvet of the dust sheet, hanging still and lifeless. My heart hammered a frantic rhythm against my ribs. It wasn't just the house anymore. It was me. The isolation was getting to me, playing tricks. Shoving the growing unease down, I pulled out my phone. No signal. Not even a bar. I went back to my study, the faint light of my laptop screen a small comfort against the encroaching gloom of the estate. I typed out an email to a colleague, detailing some architectural ideas for the main hall, trying to inject normalcy into the escalating strangeness. I hit send, watched the little progress bar crawl, then stall. Network error. I tried again. Same result. My jaw tightened. The satellite internet had been spotty, yes, but never completely dead. Not like this. Sleep offered no escape. I dreamt I was a child again, in a garden that was both familiar and utterly alien. My grandmother, long past, stood by a gnarled oak, her back to me. I called out, but her form wavered, her silhouette stretching, distorting, until he was impossibly tall, her head touching the branches. Her voice, when it came, was not the gentle lilt I remembered, but a low, guttural growl, echoing the T sound from earlier. I ran, my small legs pumping, but the garden paths twisted, leading me back to the oak, back to the towering, faceless figure. The air grew thick with that same cloying scent, pressing down on me, suffocating. I woke with a gasp, drenched in sweat, my hands fumbling for the bedside lamp. The power was out. My phone, still dead, offered no light. The silence was profound, broken only by my ragged breathing. Clutching the flashlight, I ventured out, the floorboards groaning underfoot. Each creak, each rustle of a curtain in the unseen breeze, felt amplified, sinister. The flashlight beam danced over peeling wallpaper and dusty conduits. I pushed through a heavy, unmarked door, revealing a cramped, utilitarian space. Wires snaked along the walls, connecting to an old, rusted breaker box. The air hung thick and still, heavy with a metallic tang. As I stepped further inside, my light fell upon a small, wooden crate tucked into a corner, half hidden by a tangle of old pipes. Curiosity, or perhaps a desperate need for distraction, pulled me towards it. I knelt, my fingers brushing away a thick layer of dust. Inside, nestled amongst yellowed newspapers, was a small, tarnished silver locket. I pried it open. Inside, on one side, was a faded photograph of a young woman, her eyes wide and unsettlingly familiar. On the other, instead of another photograph, was a single, crudely etched symbol, a jagged, incomplete circle, like a mouth perpetually open. I spun around, flashlight beams sweeping frantically. But the room felt different now, charged. Then, a flicker. In the periphery of my vision, at the very edge of the flashlight's glow, a shape coalesced. Tall, gaunt, indistinct, but unmistakably human-like. It stood by the breaker box, its form shimmering like heat haze off asphalt. Its head tilted, as if observing me, and I could almost feel its gaze, a pressure against my mind. My hand trembled, the locket slipping from my grasp and clattering to the concrete floor. The figure remained, a silent, watchful sentinel. I wanted to scream, to run, but my feet felt rooted to the spot. My mind raced, trying to find a rational explanation, but there was none. This wasn't isolation playing tricks. This wasn't just an old house. This was real. And it wanted me to remember. My sanity, I realized with a sickening lurch, was no longer just a concern. It was a battleground. The whisper pulled me, a thin, reedy sound, like dry leaves skittering across forgotten stone. It wasn't a human voice, not exactly, but something that mimicked the idea of one, twisting the air around me. I stumbled, the flashlight beam dancing wildly, painting fleeting specters in the gloom of the old relative's study. The humming in the walls intensified, a low thrum that vibrated in my teeth. It felt like the house itself was a vast, slumbering organism, and I had just poked it awake. I followed the sound, or perhaps it was pulling me, through a labyrinth of dusty corridors I hadn't properly explored, past doors that groaned on unseen hinges, into deeper, colder parts of the estate. I realized I was descending, the incline gradual but relentless. My hand brushed against a wall, finding it covered in a fine, gritty dust. It wasn't speaking words, but impressions, hungry. Lost. Hours. Finally, the passage opened into a vast, cavernous space. My flashlight cut a shaky path through the absolute blackness. This was it, the place I'd glimpsed in my nightmares, the one the old caretaker had hinted at, the place where things were processed. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. It was enormous, far larger than anything I'd imagined existing beneath the estate. The air here was dead, devoid of sense save for that persistent metallic tang, but also charged, prickling my skin. My light caught on a series of thick, industrial-grade wires running along the ceiling, disappearing into the gloom. What were they for? Then I saw it. A table, crudely constructed from heavy planks, stood in the center of the space. On it, amidst a scattering of brittle, yellowed papers and a few rusted tools, lay an open journal. A morbid curiosity, stronger than my fear, tugged me closer. I had to. My fingers trembled as I picked up the journal. The paper crackled like old bone. The handwriting was cramped, precise, almost elegant, yet filled with a desperate urgency. It was a chronicle, a log. Not of construction or finances, but of offerings. I scanned the pages, my eyes darting over dates, names, not names I recognized, but hints of family connections, distant branches. The entries spoke of the deep hunger, the earth's mouth, the keeper of forgotten things. It wasn't a beast, not a ghost. It was something primal, ancient, rooted to this land. It had no form, only an appetite. It fed on despair, on loneliness, on the unraveling of memory. It consumed the ties that bound a person to their reality, leaving behind an empty husk. My gaze snagged on a passage, highlighted by a faded, desperate scribble of the architect, an empty vessel, a mind rich with potential, yet vulnerable to the currents of the past. One who builds, yet has nothing of their own to anchor them. The perfect conduit. My breath caught. An architect. Me. I read on, my vision blurring, but the words burned themselves into my mind. My ancestors hadn't simply inherited this land, they were its custodians, bound by a terrible, ancient pact. They didn't worship it, they placated it. They offered it what it craved, what kept it dormant, contained. And when the old bloodline thinned, when the designated caretaker grew too old or too weak, a new one was sought, lured back to the estate. The unique architectural project, the fresh start, it was all a carefully constructed lure. A psychological cage, built with my own ambitions. The house is a crucible, one entry read, designed to strip away the superfluous, leaving only the raw, potent essence of isolation and fear. This wasn't just a house, it was a living trap. And I wasn't just an inheritor, I was the next offering. My distant relative's sudden death, the inexplicable isolation I'd felt since arriving, the vanishing pictures, the phone calls that never connected, it all clicked into place with horrifying clarity. It was the entity at work, slowly, meticulously, preparing me. I was caught. My initial determination to fix, to build, to understand, now felt like the naive thrashing of a fly caught in a spider's web. It wasn't just one voice, but a chorus of faint, indistinct murmurs, like 1,000 forgotten thoughts trying to coalesce. They were the memories, the fears, the despair of all those who had come before me. And they were waiting for me to join them. My flashlight beam, which had seemed so robust moments ago, flickered. I wasn't alone. I hadn't been alone since the moment I stepped onto this land. And the entity, the keeper, the deep hunger, whatever it was, knew I finally understood. It could feel my fear, taste my dawning despair. And it was hungry. My fingers clenched around the journal, the brittle paper groaning in protest. My distant relative's sudden death, the inexplicable isolation I'd felt since arriving, the vanishing pictures, everything clicked into place with a sickening finality. It wasn't a haunting, it was a hunger. And I was the meal. A cold dread, far deeper than any I'd known, seeped into my bones, but beneath it, a desperate spark ignited. I wasn't going to lie down and become another memory consumed. I wouldn't. I tore my gaze from the scrawled warnings, my eyes sweeping the study, then beyond, to the ominous hallways. Fight or flee. Both seemed impossible, but inaction felt like surrender. I started with the desk, rifling through drawers, scattering papers. My hands trembled, but my movements were sharp, frantic. What could I use? A weapon? A key? Another clue? The journal had spoken of an old way, a warding. Vague, maddeningly so. I needed specifics. I pulled out a heavy brass letter opener, its blade dull but pointed. Pathetic, against whatever lurked in the shadows, but it was something. A tangible weight in my hand. The house seemed to respond to my frantic energy. A low groan rumbled through the floorboards beneath my feet, not a settling of old timber, but something deeper, resonant, like a vast, irritated beast stirring from slumber. My breath hitched. A trick of the light, I told myself, but my spine disagreed, prickling with an icy awareness. I moved from the study, a frantic search consuming me. The library, the dining room, the grand hall. Each step I took was met with a subtle resistance, a growing pressure in the air. They slithered around my ears, brushing against my sanity, threatening to unravel the fragile thread of my resolve. I shoved open a heavy oak door, revealing a small, forgotten antechamber I hadn't properly explored. Cobwebs draped like forgotten tapestries. My gaze fell upon a small, ornate chest tucked beneath a faded tapestry depicting a hunting scene. It wasn't locked. Inside, nestled on a bed of yellowed silk, lay a single, tarnished silver locket. It was heavy, cool to the touch. But it wasn't the locket itself that caught my attention. It was the small, folded parchment beneath it. With trembling hands, I unfolded the brittle paper. It was a crude drawing, a symbol, a jagged, interlocking pattern of lines and circles, almost tribal in its design. Below it, in my distant relative's familiar, elegant script, was a single word, salt. Salt? What did that mean? A ward? A protective barrier? The absurdity of it warred with the desperate hope blooming in my chest. It was a lead, a direction, however meager. I clutched the drawing, the locket forgotten, a renewed surge of determination coursing through me. I needed salt. Lots of it. And I needed to understand this symbol. My discovery, my renewed hope, seemed to enrage it. The very structure of the house began to groan, not just the timbers, but the stone, the plaster. The floor beneath my feet vibrated, a low, guttural hum filling the air. The temperature plummeted, and my breath plumed in front of me. The metallic, earthy smell intensified, growing putrid. Suddenly, the antechamber twisted. The floor tilted violently, throwing me off balance. Disoriented, gasping for air, I tried to push myself up, my head throbbing. When my vision cleared, the antechamber was gone. I was in an entirely different place, yet still within the suffocating grip of the entity's dominion. My surroundings were stark, brutal. The air here was frigid, thick with the scent of stagnant water and something sterile, yet deeply unsettling. The walls were rough, unpainted concrete, streaked with what looked like ancient damp. No windows, no doors I could immediately discern. Just a suffocating box. The silence was profound, save for the frantic thudding of my own heart against my ribs and the rhythmic drip of water somewhere in the oppressive blackness. This wasn't just a hallucination, it felt utterly real, more real than the antechamber I'd just been in. It was a physical manifestation of my isolation, a prison conjured from fear. Then, a sound. It was slow, deliberate, like something immense being pulled across a rough surface. The sound grew closer, each scrape punctuated by a wet, sucking noise. My blood felt like ice water in my veins. My hands, still clutching the drawing of the symbol, started to shake uncontrollably. I scrambled backward, pressing myself against the rough concrete wall, my eyes wide, straining to pierce the black. The scraping stopped. The air grew even heavier, crushing my lungs. I tried to scream, but only a choked gasp escaped my throat. It was immense, indistinct, yet undeniably there. It pulsed with a malevolent energy that made every nerve ending in my body scream. This was it. The entity, fully revealed, fully unleashed. And I was trapped in its custom-made hell, clutching a drawing and the desperate, useless word, salt. The drawing, clutched tight in my fist, felt like a lifeline. Salt. A ward. The words echoed in my head, a strange, archaic whisper against the encroaching silence of the house. I had to find it. I had to find any way to fight back. My determination, briefly rekindled, pushed me through the echoing halls, my footsteps loud against the polished wood. First, though, an escape. If I could just get out, find a way to the road, to another living soul. I tried the main doors again, twisting the ornate brass handle with all my might. It clicked, then spun uselessly, refusing to budge. The heavy oak felt like solid rock. I moved to the nearest window, a grand pane overlooking the overgrown gardens. I picked up a heavy porcelain vase from a nearby table, its base cold and smooth in my hand. Taking a deep breath, I swung it, aiming for the glass. The impact was jarring, a dull thud, not the expected crash. The vase bounced off the window pane as if it were solid steel, leaving not a scratch, not a crack. My hand stung. I tried again, harder, putting my full weight into the swing. Nothing. The glass remained pristine, reflecting my own desperate, wide-eyed face back at me. It wasn't just old, it was impregnable. The house wasn't just isolated, it was a fortress, built to keep things in, or out, or both. I tried other windows, other doors. Each one met with the same impenetrable resistance. It was as if the very structure of the estate had hardened against my will. Frustration simmered, then boiled over into a raw, guttural cry that died in the suffocating quiet. Cupboards gaped empty, drawers held only dust and forgotten utensils. No salt shaker. No bag. My frantic rummaging yielded only disappointment. I moved through the pantry, the laundry room, even the dusty and used servants' quarters. The longer I searched, the more the house seemed to shift around me. Corridors I remembered as straight now subtly curved, leading me to rooms I didn't recognize. A plain wooden door, which I swore had always led to a small utility closet, now opened onto a long, dimly lit passage I'd never seen before. The air here was heavy with the smell of damp concrete and something metallic, like old blood and rust. A faint, rhythmic drip echoed from somewhere ahead. My heart hammered, a frantic drum against my ribs. Logic screamed at me to turn back, but a morbid curiosity, coupled with the drawing's desperate hope, pulled me forward. This wasn't part of the plans. This wasn't the house I'd studied, the one I'd intended to restore. The passage was narrow, the rough concrete walls pressing in. Bare pipes snaked along the ceiling, some dripping, others coated in a thick, greenish slime. Then, the passage opened into a larger space, a cavernous, desolate chamber. My breath hitched. It was the intake holding area during power outage. The space was vast, crudely constructed from reinforced concrete, with a low, arched ceiling that seemed to absorb all light. The air was thick, stagnant, carrying the scent of decay and something else. Something clinical and metallic, yet utterly abandoned. Along one wall, bolted to the floor, were rows of rusted, skeletal cots, their thin mattresses long gone, leaving only warped springs and corroded frames. A few overturned plastic buckets lay scattered, their purpose long forgotten. A wave of nausea washed over me. This wasn't part of the house. This was a nightmare made real, a phantom limb of a forgotten place. I spun around, desperate to find the passage I'd come through, but it was gone. Panic, sharp and icy, began to claw at my throat. Your design. I strained my eyes, but there was nothing there. You think you can build? You only destroy. My breath hitched. The words were a knife twisting in an old wound, a memory of a project that had gone disastrously wrong, a client lost, my reputation tarnished. I'd buried that memory deep, convinced myself it was a learning experience. Suddenly, the flickering bulb intensified, then dimmed, then pulsed erratically. You promised us a legacy, Raj. What have you done? Their voices, full of the specific regret I'd always feared, resonated through the concrete space. It wasn't just an illusion of sound, it was an illusion of feeling. The crushing weight of their expectations, the quiet judgment I'd always felt, pressed down on me, heavy as the concrete ceiling. My architectural models, the triumphs I'd been so proud of, appeared as spectral, crumbling structures around me, dissolving into dust at the slightest touch. This was it. The entity wasn't just trying to scare me, it was trying to dismantle me, piece by piece, twisting my achievements into failures, my hopes into regrets. It fed on my isolation, yes, but more than that, it fed on the erosion of myself, the slow, agonizing unraveling of everything I believed myself to be. The house wasn't just a physical labyrinth, it was a psychological one, designed to trap me not in its walls, but within the prison of my own shattered mind. The salt. The drawing. They felt impossibly far away now, the last vestiges of hope dissolving in the face of this relentless, personal assault. I was lost. Utterly, terrifyingly lost. And the house, or whatever resided within it, was just getting started. It clung to my skin, seeped into my bones, a constant, dull ache that mirrored the hollowness in my chest. The emergency lights, sputtering in the cavernous space, cast long, wavering shadows that danced like specters along the peeling concrete walls. I clutched the river stone in my hand, its smooth, cool surface a small anchor in the maelstrom of my thoughts. The spiral symbol etched into it felt almost alive against my palm. The entity had chipped away at everything, my memories, my connections, my very sense of self. It had twisted my past, made me doubt my own name. It pressed in, a suffocating presence that tasted of dust and forgotten grief. They weren't distinct words, but a jumble of accusations, regrets, and fears, all pulled from the deep recesses of my mind. My failures as an architect, the project that had gone so spectacularly wrong, the client's disappointed face, it all played out in a looping, agonizing reel behind my eyes. You always fail. My knees threatened to buckle. The sheer weight of the psychological assault was immense, a physical force intent on driving me to the ground. I felt my grip on the stone falter, my resolve waver. This was what it wanted, my complete surrender, the final severing of my identity. But something ignited within me. A stubborn ember of defiance. I wouldn't give it the satisfaction. I wouldn't become another forgotten memory in its endless feast. My ancestors' words echoed, the light within. I squeezed the stone, focusing on the intricate spiral, a symbol of continuity, of the self that persists through change. I saw the blurred outline of a colleague, their face contorted in disgust. I saw my own reflection, distorted and monstrous, mocking me from a phantom pane of glass. No, I choked out, the word raw and thin against the overwhelming din. You don't get to do this. I closed my eyes, pressing the stone hard against my forehead. I forced myself to recall concrete, undeniable truths. My name. The feel of my own hands sketching, the smell of fresh ink on paper. The burning ambition that had first drawn me to architecture, before the failures, before the doubt. I wasn't just my mistakes, I was the sum of every choice, every struggle, every moment of genuine effort. My breath caught in my throat, my lungs burning. This was its truest form, the complete erasure of self. But I held on. I pictured the spiral, an unbroken line. I focused on the idea of my truth, separate from the lies it tried to feed me. My own unique identity, resilient and whole. The stone grew warm against my skin, a faint pulse emanating from its core. With a ragged cry, I opened my eyes. The distorted reflection of myself flickered and vanished. It was as if a veil had been torn, a momentary clarity breaking through the entity's suffocating hold. A wave of exhaustion washed over me, leaving me trembling, but I remained standing. The entity hadn't been vanquished, not truly. But I had pushed it back. I had found a way to resist, to assert my own reality against its pervasive illusions. I looked around the desolate chamber, the emergency lights still struggling, but no longer seeming to conspire against me. I pressed the stone against my forehead, a desperate anchor. The cold, rough surface was a single, undeniable truth in a world that had twisted into a funhouse mirror. My name. Raj. The smell of ink, the satisfying scratch of a charcoal stick on thick paper. The hunger to create, to build, that had once burned so brightly. I clung to these fragments, willing them to rebuild the shattered mosaic of myself. What happened next is a blur. A raw, animal instinct took over. It wasn't a choice, not really. It was a surge of pure, unadulterated need to escape. I remember stumbling, the splintered wood of the floorboards beneath my bare feet, the frantic scrabble of my hands against a doorframe, a window. The air outside hit me like a physical blow, sharp, frigid, smelling of pine and damp earth, utterly real. I ran. I don't know for how long. Through the gnarled woods, the branches clawing at my skin, the unseen roots tripping me. My lungs burned, a searing pain that was almost a comfort, proof that my body was still mine, still fighting. The whispers, the phantom memories, they tried to follow, to wrap around me like tendrils of fog, but the cold wind seemed to tear through them. I ran until my legs gave out, until the world tilted and went black. When I woke, the world was still dark, but a different kind of dark. The air was stale, smelling of disinfectant and something else. A faint, metallic tang I couldn't quite place. My clothes were rough, unfamiliar, a thin, scratchy fabric that chafed my skin. My own clothes, I realized with a jolt, were gone. I was on a narrow cot, a thin blanket pulled up to my chin. My head throbbed, a dull ache behind my eyes. My throat was raw, my lips cracked. I tried to sit up, my muscles screaming in protest. A man, sitting hunched over a desk illuminated by a battery-powered lantern, looked up. He was a large man, his face a roadmap of worry lines, his uniform a rumpled blue. He just watched me, his expression unreadable. "You're awake," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Took you long enough?" I tried to speak, but only a dry cough escaped. He pushed a paper cup of water across the desk towards me. I reached for it, my hand trembling, the small plastic cup rattling against the metal. The water was cool, tasteless, but it was the most beautiful thing I had ever consumed. Where am I? I croaked, my voice a stranger's. "You were found," the man said, ignoring my question. "Wandering the old logging trails. Barefoot. Hypothermic. Been out for a while." He paused, his gaze assessing. "You don't remember, do you?" I shook my head slowly, the movement sending a fresh wave of nausea through me. Fragments returned, like shards of broken glass, the house, the twisting corridors, the feeling of something ancient and hungry watching me, the stone in my hand, the desperate flight. But the details, the timeline, it was all a jumble. "They said you went missing weeks ago," the man continued, his voice softer now, almost sympathetic. "Your colleague reported it. The estate. It's remote. No cell service. No one thought to look that deep. Weeks. Weeks." The word echoed in the small, flickering room, a hammer blow to my already fragile sense of reality. The entity hadn't just distorted my perception of time, it had stolen it. It had severed my connection to the outside world, not just in my mind, but in tangible, undeniable reality. It had made me disappear. I looked down at my hands. They were thin, scarred, and the skin was pale, almost translucent. My nails were broken, dirt caked beneath them. "Still there?" The man frowned, rubbing a hand over his tired face. "The house is always there. Old place. Been empty for decades before you showed up. Strange stories about it, too. People go in, don't always come out right. He leaned forward slightly, his eyes holding a strange glint. You were lucky, son. Most folks, they just fade away. He was found your car parked out on the main road, keys in the ignition. Get you some proper food. A phone call. A phone call. The thought felt alien, impossible. Who would I even call? What would I say? I was gone for weeks, trapped in a house that fed on my sanity, and now I'm back, but I'm not really back asterisk? As he turned to retrieve a clipboard from a shelf, I felt it. A faint hum, like a distant, enormous engine. It was still there. Not in the room, not in this sterile, temporary holding area, but somewhere, waiting. A part of me knew it was still tied to the estate, perhaps contained by the boundaries of the land itself, but another, more terrifying part, suspected it had left an imprint. A seed. The world outside the house now seemed just as precarious, just as prone to illusion. I had escaped, yes. But the entity hadn't been defeated. I was no longer just Raj, the architect. I was Raj, the survivor, forever marked by the echo of something truly ancient and truly malevolent. The tension didn't leave me, it merely shifted, settling deep into my bones, a permanent resident,